So we're going to start, and I'm going to pass over to one of the trustees for Building Bridges for Peace, Claire.
Hello and good evening. You're all very welcome to this event marking 21 years since Jo Berry and Pat Magee began their incredible journey of working together, beginning with that initial conversation at the Dublin home of the remarkable Anne Gallagher. As Jo mentioned, I'm Claire and I'm a trustee for Building Bridges for Peace. We also have another two trustees present with us this evening, Amanda Brown and Erica Lewis, who both provide invaluable expertise through their skills. Building Bridges for Peace is a charity founded by Jo in 2009, as I'm sure you're all aware, to promote peace and conflict transformation around the world. Jo and I go back a really long way. We first met in a field in Lincolnshire at a camp, which was supporting those who were practicing gentle, respectful parenting. So we first started honing our listening and empathy skills there. And I was honoured and humbled to witness Jo first sharing her story at that camp. And we became really good friends, and we've shared our joys and our tears and our challenges and had lots of insights and growth and supported each other this past 30 years. And I, like countless others around the world, have been and continue to feel very inspired by her courage, her commitment and dedication to peace, demonstrating the power of empathy as a tool to conflict transformation and healing. And it's been amazing to see Building Bridges for Peace begin, grow and continue to flourish over the years, doing valuable work in many communities and countries around the world. It's been a real honour to witness the journey that her and Pat have been on together this past 21 years. And I hope you'll all be really inspired by this evening's conversation. And it's a great pleasure now to introduce Michael Appleton, who was the producer of the 2001 documentary Facing the Enemy. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Claire. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
You can hear me great. I'm not going to detain you long. I'm as anxious to get to Jo and Pat as you are. The reason I got to meet both of them at all was due to an extraordinary friend of Jo and Pat's, Anne Gallagher, who arranged their first meeting in Dublin and who affected many people's lives, mine included. Anne Gallagher was a super collider of a human being, crashing people together from across all kinds of impossible angles and divides through her post-conflict work with seeds of hope. And just like the Large Hadron Super Collider at CERN, secrets were uncovered about the universe as a result. We owe her, and I owe her, an unrepayable debt. She suggested I come down to Dublin one evening in 2000 with a crew, and Anne was a very hard person to say no to. It was a disorientating moment. We walked in, it turned out, on Jo and Pat's second meeting, in the middle of unexpected, life-changing events following their first encounter a few weeks earlier. Somehow, with their permission, we were able to capture part of this second meeting. I knew we had witnessed something beyond ordinary, which would form part of a BBC Everyman documentary. And non-ordinary discoveries about human nature continue to emerge 8 years after Anne's tragic death and 21 years after Jo's first meeting with Pat. You might think those meetings had safely reached shore by now, but they haven't. What's so exhilarating about this is it's a live process that hasn't run out of steam. Had this been a simple forgiveness and reconciliation story, we wouldn't be here now. It's a process still unfolding with all the uncertainties and tensions you might expect of a woman working with the man who killed her father. One from Ireland, but who grew up in England, the other from a traditional, even aristocratic English background, but who had been closely tailing Ireland and its history ever since the events that intruded on her life in 1984. They continue to be each other's most honest interviewer, Their process is one never truly at rest. It still hasn't reached a destination and possibly never will, because while on a personal level there is immense trust, on a global level there is a tension and a still unresolved aspect that goes to the heart of this personal journey. This is a private peace process, but one that's been made visible by them, requiring huge courage and integrity. No two encounters are the same. I'm humbled in their presence on many occasions and feel much the same anticipation and lack of predictability now as in Anne's back room 20 odd years ago. So I'm going to hand over to them now and they're going to speak to us, and I believe we're handing over first to Jo.
Thank you. I'm so in touch with the me that 21 years ago got on a ferry from Holyhead, because I lived in North Wales, to go to Dublin on my own. I was terrified. I was full of fears and doubts, but there was something in me that knew I had to get to Anne's house and had to meet Patrick Magee so something could be restored in me. But let me take you back. What was it that spurred me on that day? It was so soon after the peace process, and a lot of people had told me that it was not the right time to meet Patrick Magee. So what was it that motivated me so much to get on that ferry that day with such little support? Two days after my father was killed, when I was 27, I remember making that commitment. I don't want an enemy. I want to understand those who killed my father, because I knew to have an enemy was going to affect me for the rest of my life. So a journey started, a journey with no map, with no name, with no support, but I was determined not just to understand those who killed my father, but also to bring something positive out of what had happened. And the first time that I had the idea about building a bridge with someone from the other side was just a few months after my dad was killed, when I ended up sharing a taxi with a complete stranger. And I knew he was from Northern Ireland. So I said to him, "Do you know anything about the IRA? Because I'm trying to understand, why would someone join the IRA? Because my father's just been killed." And he said, "I do, because my brother was in the IRA and he was killed last year by a British soldier." So at that time, this is the middle of the conflict, we could have been enemies. We represented different sides, and yet we spoke of a world where peace was possible. And I remember leaving that taxi thinking, I can build a bridge across a divide. And even though no one knows, I know. And I spent a couple of years traveling around Belfast in 85 and 86, but it was only with the peace process that my life changed again. I remember turning on the news one day in the headlines, and there is Patrick Magee being released from prison. I was shocked. I didn't know he was coming out of prison that day or any day. And my first thought was, what's he feeling? What's he thinking? But of course, he got whisked away into a car, and the world's press was there, and there wasn't time, there wasn't space. But the thought came to me, maybe this would be a good time now to meet him with the peace process. And I started going over to Northern Ireland. And back in 85, someone had introduced me to the most amazing woman, Anne Gallagher. And we became sisters, we became friends. And I remember us, both young women, laughing a lot and talking about peace. And she introduced me to one of her brothers who was in prison. He was part of the INLA, which is a breakaway group of the IRA. And I've still got the letters that his brother wrote. And those letters were very, very precious to me. I remember that they always ended with, "I just want you to know I'm also a human being, and let me know what I can do for you." So when I started going back, I met Anne again, and we both went together to these amazing reconciliation residentials. And she herself had a big story about what she'd experienced in the conflict. She worked as a nurse in the middle of Belfast, and she certainly saw horrors that no one should have to see. And I started meeting people who knew Patrick Magee. It's quite a small world in Northern Ireland. And every time I met someone who knew him, I would say, can you arrange this meeting? And I even had a mediator who said they could arrange the meeting. And each time I heard back, no, he doesn't want to meet you. And I remember being disappointed, but then also thinking, if it's meant to happen, if it's right, it's going to happen. And in the meantime, there are many other people to meet. I was meeting families of the hunger strikers. I was meeting people who've been affected by Bloody Sunday. So there are many, many people to meet and listen to. And I was immersing myself in the stories of people who represented my other. And one day I shared a poem that I'd written for Patrick Magee called Bridges Can Be Built. And it was a conference Anne had organised in Dunleary. And someone came up to me after that and said, I can arrange the meeting. I know you want to meet him. How long do you need? And I said, give me 24 hours and I'll be there. And Anne Gallagher was there and she said, oh, Jo, you might need a few days to prepare. I said, okay, give me a few days. And I somehow knew that might lead to me actually meeting Patrick Magee. And 2 months later, I got a phone call on a Friday, 21 years ago, from Anne. And she was like, Jo, can you be there at my house this evening? 7:00. And my first thought was, not today. I'm not in the mood. I'm going away for the weekend to my Glencree, which is my safe space in Ireland. I can't think of this. But then I thought, how would this feel? Okay, this is so huge. So I said to Anne, I'll be there at 7:00. She said, right, I'll see you then. And off she went. And as I travelled on the ferry, I thought of Anne on the other side, knowing that she was going to meet me, and that gave me a source of strength. I'm going to pass over to Patrick now for him to share what it was that led him to say yes when he asked whether he'd like to meet me. Thank you. Over to you, Patrick. You unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jo. The first thing I would like to say is that even after 21 years, I find it difficult. It's hard to put yourself back in that moment. And you'd think after all our meetings, and there have been, I'm sure, in excess of 200 such meetings and conversations, still find it difficult. It can be extremely difficult. And yet we continue to meet and to carry on the conversation. So putting myself back to that first time and the lead up to it, well, to set it in the context, it was the peace process, a big part of which was the release of the political prisoners, as we would have seen it. And so you're awaiting the gate being opened and emerging into this new dispensation of peace and wondering how you might contribute to its development. I would have imagined, for example, being involved in some capacity with dealing with the legacy of the conflict. So I have seen myself sitting around a table with our former enemies and talking to them, to listen to them, hear their narrative, and to explain our perspective to them and to exchange. And hopefully that would help to bed down the process. We'd begin to understand each other better that would be a contribution to the success, continuing success of the process, the building of the peace. Our victims, the victims of the conflict, were a part of that. I also imagined that, that I would be meeting victims. I think that's part of every post-conflict situation. So I was in that frame of mind, but with nothing firm about how this could be achieved, accomplished. And I was out of prison 17 months when, no, that's not. I was out of prison about a year when I heard that somebody connected to Brighton, who had lost a relative in Brighton, wanted to meet me. I was the only person identified with that operation. And, well, I felt an obligation to meet this person. When the actual meeting took place 5 months later, so 17 months after my release, on the 24th of November 2000, 21 years ago, I would have went along very much thinking of it as a political obligation, this responsibility to make a contribution to the peace process. And then you're on the threshold, about to walk through. There's a small house, terraced house, small house, quite comfortable house in Dublin, Anne Gallagher's house. And I don't think the full enormity of what I was about to do sank in until I was there at the door and assailed by thoughts, chief among them. How would I respond if I was about to meet somebody who would have hurt somebody belonged to me? And in that moment, all your, the assurance you felt that all you had to do is go along and set the context and the conflict in some form of a context, and that itself would help. I lost that confidence, and it was a scary moment. And brought into Anne's kitchen. Joe was there. Some friends were there of Anne's. And I found I couldn't talk in front of anybody. So in other words, as I said, this confidence I had that I'm going there to perform a sort of a political, obligation. Lost that. Anne spotted the discomfort and suggested we move into a side room. It was actually her conservatory. And we sat, myself and Joe, on our own and talked for 3 hours. Now, I had no inkling of time passing or that 3 hours. The meeting had lasted 3 hours. Such was the intensity of that experience. The sharing, Joe revealing things about herself and talking about her father. Me beginning with explaining from our perspective, the Republican perspective, why we were engaged in this conflict. And it's just some midpoint in that 3 hours. I think it was sometime around the point where Joe, I should mentioned it earlier, she read me the poem she had written about 3 months prior to that first meeting. She read this poem to me, and the words of the poem seemed to prefigure the actual meeting. She hadn't met me at this stage, but the poem seemed to prefigure the actual meeting, and I thought that in itself was remarkable. And it was like a hinge moment, and I started to move away from this just a political obligation. It became more a personal need, to understand and to listen and hear what she had to say. And she was telling me about her father and how close they had become, particularly, in the last period. And, well, I'm listening intently. And I'm recognizing that Jo seems a very fine woman, a clever woman, great humanity, very articulate. And it was like a click in my head. All this I recognized in Jo, I felt must have come in some measure from her father, from her upbringing closest to her father. And I'd killed this guy. I killed Jo's father. And that means I'd killed a fine human being. I've seen it in the daughter. I killed her father, fine human being. And it changed many things for me. We talk about the lessons after 21 years. That was nearly an immediate lesson. Hadn't quite formed the words to fit it. That came in subsequent weeks. But I would explain it like this. We as Republicans felt demonized and censored, that our perspective was not understood, and we're in fact silenced. And I now began to realize, that at some level, we were also culpable for that demonization. I had not, Jo's father, Anthony Barry, was not specifically a target. We were targeting something like the Tory party or the British government. And we talked about those culpable for the conflict because they had all the power. We weren't seeing human beings. We were seeing ciphers. We were seeing labels. We were therefore also guilty of this demonization. And you can argue that in conflict, that's necessary. In order to be in struggle with this enemy, you somehow have to have this reduced view of them. You don't see them in their full humanity, and perhaps can't if you're in conflict with them. So there's a narrowing of perspective. And then suddenly I'm in the presence of Jo, just talking about her father, and something was unveiled there in that moment for me. And I think that has been at the heart of our journey since, certainly my journey. Trying to, how would you put it? Try to get a wider perspective on those we were in conflict with and understand their pain and their side of it, their story. And that's a continuing conversation. I can hand back to you, Jo.
This is the first time we've spoken on Zoom together, and I didn't know what it would be like, but I can feel what it was like at that first meeting through your words and what you're feeling, and how I'm just amazed that the journey that we've had together. And I want to thank you for the courage you showed that day and the courage you still show. But I'm going back to that first meeting to share my experience of it. So before Patrick arrived, it was a busy house, people coming and going. And at one point, Anne gave me a wooden spoon and said, "Oh, Jo just finished cooking. I've got to make a phone call." And I looked at her and I was like, I can't focus on food. I can't focus on anything, because the next person is going to come in is Patrick. And sure enough, there was a knock on the door, and in he walked. And I remember getting up and I shook his hand and thanked him for coming. And he said, "Thank you for inviting me." And I said, "I'm really grateful that you changed your mind, because I heard you didn't want to meet me and now you're here." And he said, "Oh, I have actually heard a few times that one of my victims wants to meet me, and I've always said yes." So I kind of call that our icebreaker. And we talked about how his yeses got left into no's. And I think it was about protecting either me or him, for good reason probably. And we went into the back room, and I remember Anne coming in with drinks and biscuits and just left us to it. And we were sitting on the edge of this small sofa, so quite close to each other. And I remember at one point looking into Pat's face and going, well, you don't look like my idea of a terrorist. Some very strange thoughts. Another part said, leave now. You're with the man who killed your father. Go while you can. This is betraying your father. But a stronger part stayed and was present and listened, because I really want to see Pat as a human being. And I knew from other men I'd met who'd been in the IRA a little bit of what that Pat would want to arrive with, a sense of the Republican story, the difficulties they had, the challenges, how they'd been oppressed and didn't have the same human rights. And he would talk about that, which he did. And it was a way of justifying his actions. And I knew he was going to do that. And I was actually fine, because what I really wanted to see was some of his humanity. And I listened and asked questions, and I was really curious. And at one point, Patrick's talking about the people in his community and what they suffered and how he felt, how he cared about them. And I saw in him now a man with a story who suffered, who struggled. He's not just the man who planted that bomb. And when I saw his humanity, that's when I knew my need to be met. I didn't meet him to change him. I didn't meet him to get an apology. I met him just to see him as a human being, because he was the most demonized person at that time. And that wasn't going to help me, but it would help me to see him as a human being. But it was hard hearing the justification of my dad. And at that time, I was still deeply affected by my dad going. In fact, I still am. Those things affect us forever. So I was about to leave when Patrick stopped talking, and he looked at me, and he rubbed his eye, and I remember it so well. He said, I don't know anymore who I am. Can I hear your anger and your pain? And never met anyone so open as you. Or what can I do for you? And I knew in that moment that he'd taken off the political hat. And it was no longer just my need to meet him. He now had a need to meet me. And a new journey started for Patrick, which he shared a little what that journey is about. And this was more than I bargained for. And I do remember thinking, maybe I should go, this is too much. But I did stay. And the conversation was very different after that, because we're both together talking with vulnerability, without blaming each other, without judgment, just listening, and a very special place where we could hear each other's pain. And Patrick did start asking a lot of questions about my dad. And I could see that for the first time, he is seeing him as a human being. And that means something to me. Another hour and a half, I knew I'd reached my limit of listening. You know, I couldn't be present anymore, because all the time I'm listening to Patrick, I'm listening to the parts of me that are finding it difficult. But I got more than what I want from this meeting. So I said to Pat, I'm going to go now. And that's when he said to me, I'm really sorry I killed your dad. Now, I didn't need an apology, but that's not what I got from that. What I got was the knowing that my dad was a real human being. He was no longer a demonized, legitimate target. And I said something to Patrick, which I don't think he understood straight away, which was, I'm so glad it's you. And when we did meet 3 weeks later, Patrick asked me about that. And I said, I think I meant your preparedness to engage, to feel the emotional impact, to actually know that you killed a wonderful human being, and all that means is huge. And I acknowledged that. I felt very disorientated after that meeting, as if I'd broken a taboo of society, but I knew I wanted to go back. So when Anne invited us back a few weeks later, and she said to me, Patrick's agreed to be filmed. Would you be filmed? It's purely for reconciliation purposes. It's never going to go public. And I went, well, if it's never going to be public, then, and Patrick's agreed, then I will. And I think she went to Patrick and said, Patrick, Joe's agreed to be filmed. Would you agree? And he thought, well, if Joe's agreed, I'll agree. And thank goodness Anne did that. Thank goodness, because that meant that Michael Appleton came to the second meeting and we could film it. And even though the second meeting still captured some of the intensity of those raw first meetings. And because we then had people who wanted to make a film, a documentary, we had support so we could carry on meeting for the next year. And without that, I don't think it would have been possible. There's been so much serendipity, people just being there at the same time, which led to the last 20 years happening. And I'm going to pass over to Patrick now.
Thanks, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, the one thing I carried away from that meeting, that it had ended too soon. I mean, for the next week or whatever it was, I just felt there was more to be said, more I needed to hear and needed to explain. And yet I also knew that I couldn't have made the approach. I instinctively realized it would have been wrong for me as the offender, the perpetrator, to contact the victim. And so it was kind of left in abeyance, and just felt this need to hear more, to explore this further. But, you know, I never thought it was going to happen. So it was great sadness about that. And then the contact through Anne Gallagher again, that Joe was coming over, and would you like to meet her, you know, coming off the ferry, and jumped at it. I absolutely jumped at it. There was much more to hear and to explain. I went along to Anne's, and then Anne explained there just happened to be somebody handy who had the wherewithal to make a small documentary for archival purposes. Well, to be perfectly honest, I felt a bit bounced about that. I did. I was always very wary, as Republicans are, because of the treatment in the media, to leave ourselves open, you know, to the media. You know, so very wary, cautious and suspicious. And yet, I trusted Anne. And meeting Michael, I felt, well, it's for archival purposes. You know, I'll go along with it. You know, at some point I'll have some control over this, you know. And I completely support what Joe has just said. I'm so glad that happened, you know, that we get that push, you know, and it was on. And, well, we had to kind of reprise the discussion of the first meeting for the sense, to convey a sense of the first meeting, to have that recorded. But I still found that once we actually began the engagement, we forgot about the camera, and it was a useful exercise, and I think we carried it further. And we now know we spent I think about 11 months collaborating with Michael and his crew. And what started off as an archival project turned out to be quite a major documentary for the BBC Everyman series, which was broadcast for the first time in late 2001, I think about December. So that documentary tracked our meetings over that 11-month course. And some of the realizations we come to, and some of the difficult hurdles we came through, because, you know, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. Things were happening in the world. And the major event during that period was 9/11, which nearly scuppered the whole venture. From all our sides, Joe concerned, the BBC were concerned. I had my own misgivings, but we somehow, you know, regrouped and agreed to carry on, and I'm so glad that happened. You know, all these years later, you know, what's that? That's 19 years ago, 20 years ago that documentary came out. All these years later, we were continuing to meet. I lost track. I think during the first couple of years, I was keeping a track of it. You know, we had all the emails and information about the places we were talking, the invitations we received. So we were able to, make a recording of how many meetings there had. But at some point, it just hit 100, and I didn't see any point to record it any longer. And it's got to be in excess of over 200, perhaps 300. I mean, that'll be somebody can, do their best to collate all those events, because we've spoken and shared and continued the conversation, and it's always different. Multivarious events at universities, schools, prisons. In lots of different countries, and in hotspots and places that have known terrible conflict, like Rwanda, and Lebanon, and Israel, Palestine, and South Africa. And there's something universal about our experience. The scale of our conflict mightn't match the atrocious warfare other people have experienced in the world. But the pain is the same, and it's felt, it's human, it's personal, and it's making a connection. Because I think what we've demonstrated is that despite the differences, you can have a conversation. And to bring it straight down to the moment, despite the fact that I killed Joe's father, we continue to meet and trust each other. She trusts me to meet. And I think that's absolutely remarkable after 21 years. Very difficult for me to get my head around the fact that she still shows us willingness to do that. People mustn't assume that because we've met so often that it's easy. It's never easy, because of the very nature of what we're talking about here, the loss. And I suppose our bottom line is that we're encouraged to continue it, because it's an exploration for ourselves. It's things we want to learn about it, but also things we want to share, if only at the level that this is possible. Despite all this difference, that it's possible to do this in a world where there doesn't seem to be much evidence that talking can achieve much. And I think that's the main spur.
Thank you. Talking and listening. Patrick, you've become a brilliant listener. And I know that there are times when it has been challenging and I've shared what I'm feeling. And then you do listen and care and notice. And I think that builds the trust over the last 21 years. We've been to places where you're the only person I know. And you've learned that quite often I need a little bit of encouragement after I've spoken. I can be a little hard on myself. And you can give me that assurance. I remember on an aeroplane, I don't know where we were going, and you were teaching me how to do a cryptic crossword, which I'm still not great at, and you're very good at. And I remember as you were teaching me the crossword, looking around in the plane and thinking, no one would know what brought us together. We just look like two friends looking at a crossword puzzle. And on one level, that's very normal, but it's not normal. It doesn't feel already normal. It doesn't feel like I'm just seeing anyone, because though you did plant that bomb to kill my father, you've also the man who's engaged with me for 21 years, who we traveled with, and we're changing the story. And through changing that story, I feel like something is healing deeply inside myself. I adored my father, as you know. We were very close. And now you see him as a human being, that means something to me. We're all rehumanizing each other, and the appalling reality of conflict that's gone wrong is that people stop seeing each other as human beings with their humanity. They do demonize them. And it's not just in violent conflict, it's even in petty conflict as well. And the first time we spoke in public, or maybe it was the second time, we only had like a few minutes to speak each. And I remember your words, Patrick. I don't know whether you remember it, but you said, I now know I could have sat down and had a cup of tea with Joe's dad. Now, the Conservative government didn't have a policy of cups of tea for the IRA. They still don't really have a response of cups of tea with people who they don't agree with. But that cup of tea to me is precious because it's about respect and dignity and listening even if we disagree and finding ways to work and to collaborate. So to me, the metaphor of a cup of tea has now means a lot to me. And you would also say, Patrick, that you were disarmed by my empathy. And if I'd gone in there shouting and going, I'm right, you're wrong, you would have stayed in a very safe place of justification. And that really makes me think about the power of empathy and what does it mean to empathize? I believe that at times, Patrick, when you shared your story, and we did have time even during the filming when you and I were on our own, and we'd stay up late at night and you'd share things with me that perhaps you wouldn't share publicly, which is absolutely fine. And I remember reaching a point inside me where I thought, well, if I'd lived your life, if I'd been born into your family and experienced everything you'd experienced, how would I respond? You know, would I have gone the path of violence? Would I have gone the path of non-violence? I don't know. And in that moment of empathy, there is nothing to forgive. And I've had that experience with all the players in the conflicts in Northern Ireland, with the ex-loyalist combatants, with the ex-British soldiers, with the peace women, all the victims. I've just come back from Northern Ireland where I met many, many more people with powerful stories. And there's a sense that if we'd all lived each other's lives, we could have made the same choices. And then there are no sides. We move from thinking my side is important and yours isn't, to actually, how can we collaborate to meet your needs and my needs and their needs? And that to me is part of our message, that sustainable peace will only happen if we recognize that everyone has their story and has their needs. And I know that what I've learned through this last 20 years, and yes, it has been tough at times. You know, we have had breaks, but it's so valuable because of how I can now communicate with other people. That what I've been learning has helped me to be with people around the world, and how to resolve conflicts, how to listen, and also how to heal that part of me that wants to blame and make someone wrong, because it's so easy. And it's been easy with Patrick. I could have gone back many, many times to blame him, but I haven't. I've changed that response. And so therefore Patrick has been a teacher for me. And this has been a, transformational relationship. And so for today to be being reminded of that, about what the last 20 years has given me, is just extraordinary. I know that some of Anne's family are here. I know some people are here who knew me even before my father was killed. And some people have been so supportive in the last few years to develop the work. But Patrick, I'm aware it's been hard for you, and I just want to ask you a question. Emotionally, does it still feel that you're putting yourself in a difficult situation when you meet me? Because you're reminded, you're reminded of the impact of something that happened way back in the 80s. And if it is still emotionally hard, what keeps you from carrying on to meet me? I'll pass over to you, Patrick.
Well, as you already have mentioned, there were times when we stopped talking, certain periods when it became too fraught. And then we go away and we're not meeting, we're thinking, gotta mend this, gotta mend this. Because we recognize the value, not only as an example to others, but the value to ourselves too. Because you can't come through what we came through. I mean, all of us that came through that conflict, been, hurt by it and have hurt because of it. You can't come through that and just leave it in the past. There's always a reckoning. There's always the need to go over it. If only to appreciate, lessons from it and ensure that we don't make the mistakes of the past and that we explore other avenues for resolving our conflicts. So it's important from that level, that's certainly, all of that's in the mix. All of it would encourage me to continue talking, not only with yourself, but in terms generally of dealing with the past. We talk about the legacy of the past, the need, where the physical conflict has ended more or less. I think, there'll be, there's always tensions there up into the surface. Therefore, more need, to deal with the legacy, we're kind of locked in our narratives. And the only way we can break down that and arrive at some sort of common understanding of each other, not necessarily to agree, but to understand each other's perspective, is that contact. And you can only do getting people together, letting them talk, and trying to facilitate that. So, that I still feel the need. I think that's the outstanding need at the moment. Needs to be done. Need to do it on a personal level. We need to do it as communities and a society. So it's a contribution to that, I feel. And also, there's other people who try to represent our dialogue. There's been various attempts to dramatize it, write about it. And we're the only ones, I think, who understand it. And the core understanding is this willingness to listen and to explain, which means, in a sense, you can't afford anger. Somehow you have to rein it in. I'm not talking about myself with you, Joe, but the anger I feel about that conflict in the past. A lot of issues unresolved, and the politics are needed too, but you also need that dialogue with our erstwhile enemies. This is facilitating that. But the way it's dramatized somehow, and drama needs, conflict, misses, the chemistry of what we achieved. And it was simply listening and taking time not only to listen, but to explain, in a sense, slowing the dialogue down. Not going in with a message you want to get across necessarily, We know our own minds. We know our own minds, and we'll struggle to be heard and to understand. But you've got to be prepared to listen, And I think we both go realize too that the worst state of mind is certainty. That requires us to question, and go in and at least hold on to this idea. If we keep on exploring, we might think of something different, something new that move things on. No certainties. What others can you say? Also, the commonality. I think Michael mentioned our very different backgrounds. I remember meeting a group. We met a group of ex-soldiers in a group called Veterans for Peace, and they were on a tour of the north of Ireland, and we met them. And they all said something about themselves, and they'd been involved in the conflict in various times during this duration, which was 3 decades. And these were guys from the paratroopers and the Marines and different regiments and all different stories. What struck me most from meeting them was how closely I could identify with them. And not only that, I could see one and said, he's very like somebody I know. I could compare them, people I knew. In other words, we're just all ordinary guys. That's the greatest lesson I learned from that. Just ordinary guys, and there was no difference in that room. No difference when we're there together. So conveying that is very important too. The differences we have are not at that level. It's not the squatties. It's the people in power. It's the people in power. And we have to break that down, I think, or make people realize that, focus on what's common. And at that level, we have so much in common.
Thank you. Yes, certainty. I think that's something we talk about a lot, and how certainty of being so right can lead to not listening to each other. Mm-hmm. And I have so many memories of not just you, Patrick, but others. In fact, just recently when I was in Northern Ireland, of people who had been enemies, who were former enemies from the conflict, sitting together and seeing each other as human beings and laughing, and that is the truth, that when we connect, we are all human beings. So I now want to bring in someone who wrote to me. So when we went public, that was a massive thing for both of us to do, and we both at moments during the documentary tried to stop it. I feel really bad for Michael Appleton having to drag us both at different times to finish the production. And then we started getting the emails and the letters. And one person who wrote to me was Professor Lynn Cameron. She said, I just seen the documentary. Can I analyze the metaphor in your language? Are there transcripts of other meetings? And I thought, I have no idea what you mean, what you meant, but yes. And she's turned in from that letter. We've become friends. And Lynn Cameron has written a book about the metaphor in our language and created an empathy network and had to speak in different parts of the world. So there's 2 people I've asked. It could be many, many people. I've asked 2 people who have been a big part of our lives in developing our work. So Lynn, it's really hard to see where you are, but if you could unmute yourself.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe and Pat, for that conversation. It's, as always, it's moving and inspiring and full of things to think about. And yes, I did do a bit of metaphor analysis as you were talking. So I want to thank you for your openness over the last 21 years and for persevering in offering alternatives to hate and to revenge. And to just say a little bit about how your work inspired me. After I saw the documentary, and I was studying metaphor at the time, and there you were coming off the ferry and talking about building bridges, and then you were driving in a car with windscreen wipers. So there were visual metaphors going on as well. And I got, as an academic researcher into language, I found that really interesting. I've always been interested in how people understand each other. And as I get older, I get less and less certain about how people actually manage to understand each other. And so it seemed to me that yours was a case study in people at extreme distance coming together to understand each other. And I wanted to understand how you did that. So you very generously let me analyze the documentary and then some transcripts of other conversations that you'd had. And the research project got bigger and bigger, and we brought in people from Brazil and Kenya and Nepal, and we looked at conflict situations where violence had happened and how empathy can be rebuilt after that. And you were the case study, you were the prime example of how empathy could be rebuilt after violent conflict. And as an academic, you made me go back to all the literature on empathy, the new psychology of empathy, to try and understand it and to fit it to your process. And as you've talked about it today, you've made it so clear, this understanding of the other person as a human being, not agreeing with them necessarily, not approving of them, but understanding how they feel and how they see the world. And I've come to see this understanding the other person as such a vital human undertaking. It's an ethical enterprise that we all need to engage in for conflict transformation and just for living. Your conversations help me understand that we put up these barriers to empathy. We block people, we lump them together. As you've described it, we demonize them. We put them in these lumped groups and then we distance them so we don't have to look at them as human beings. We look at them as labels. And in order to reach empathy and to build it again, we need to dismantle these barriers. And your story, like you say, the specific story is what makes a difference to people who hear you. I would like to ask a question as to how this continues now after all this time. Are you still dismantling barriers to empathy in yourselves when you meet? Are they changing? Is the work of empathy ever done, or is it always being redone? Is it empathizing rather than something that can be completed?
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for your commitment to understanding empathy and building empathy in the world. And be a bit naughty, ask Patrick to answer it first. Are you ready to answer, Patrick?
I've spent the last couple of years not being so involved with speaking with Joe. We've slowed the pace down a bit because I've been focusing on writing a book. And therefore, there's a lot of introspection goes on, and you're going over the past, and going over also. It's a major part of the book. These last 21 years or 20 years, and it's that willingness, willingness to listen, willingness to have these hard conversations, despite the hardness, despite it, because you're hoping that it can act as an example to others. You feel it so worthwhile doing that can help. That's what you want to do, and so it's just being prepared to do that. Again, I go back to find myself repeating myself. It's not about me trying to convert Joe to my perspective on the world. Why would I? I'm not interested in doing that. But it would be great if Joe and others could understand the context of the conflict, our motivations. If they could do that, that's in itself huge. Then I think you can move on to the steps like recognizing the commonalities, and that people act in good faith, and that is not the way that conflict was portrayed in the media, for example. So, despite differences, that's achievable, and it's achievable by just continuing the dialogue. And another thing, you see, if it was just a matter of going along and trying to convince somebody of your righteousness, the rightness of where you came from, you can go so far with that. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have lasted 21 years, you know. So that exploration, you have a 21-year exploration because there's a lot to explore, you know, because we don't agree, you know. I mean, the conversation would soon be over. It was just me saying what motivated me and leaving it at that, you know. It is about listening and learning and sharing and explaining, you know. And I think that needs to be facilitated. I'm hoping. It's great that people like yourself, Lynn, can have that focus and to explore it and make more sense of it, and try to articulate what we were doing, you know, in a way we could never do. That's all so valuable, and it's added to it, you know, because it's not just our exploration, you know. There's conflict everywhere. It's linked, you know. It's at a human level, but it's at a political level too, and you can get through to that by understanding language. It's a means of, you know, understanding that. So, you know, there's so many ways you can come at it, you know. Let's open ourselves up to that, but it needs to be helped. When you think of all, and this is something Joe speaks very eloquently, that you speak very eloquently about, Joe, that you know, if the resources that have been geared to creating conflict in the world, if even part of those resources were targeted at facilitating dialogue to prevent conflict and increase understanding and commonality, we wouldn't have so much conflict in the world.
And I'll add a little bit. I think certainty is a massive obstacle to being able to empathize with people. So I'll speak about myself. When I'm feeling really righteous and certain, then I'm not going to be curious. I'm not going to want to listen. I'm going to be stuck and feeling very, very right and making the other person wrong. So I've always got the blocks inside myself. I'm not someone who always is in a place of acceptance and empathy. I still struggle when I'm hurting. I still look at who can I blame and make wrong, or even make myself wrong. So I'm releasing the blocks inside myself. I remember when we gave a talk, I think we've actually spoken over 400 times, but we're never going to agree on this. But we had one of our talks in a school, and there was a trustee of the school who came from a lawless community in Northern Ireland. And I don't quite know what happened, but I could sense that that was difficult for Patrick. So when we gave the talk, Patrick was speaking as if he was speaking for the Republican Party against the lawless party, and was engaged in a political discussion. And the young people loved it, and there were no questions for me. They were all for Patrick. And now that doesn't happen. Like, it was just extraordinary. And it was getting more and more difficult. And I remember after that, I felt very angry, and I did not want to empathize with Patrick. And I said something to him which was not very nice. See, I can be not nice, definitely. And then I remember looking into Patrick's eyes, and I said, "You really didn't mean to hurt me with that. That was not your intention." And in the moment of seeing that, like, my need to be annoyed and right, I disarmed myself. You know, it was like I melted, and I realized that, you know, he hadn't meant to hurt me. At that time, he was doing the best that he could. And I think the other thing about blocks to empathy is the need to create emotional safe places. So if we're going to share and listen to each other's stories, and our stories represent different sides, different opinions, we need to know there is respect there. we need to know no one's going to shout at us. If we're going to open up and be vulnerable and build that empathy and trust, we need to know it's safe. Now, I've shared my story in times when it's not safe. I know what that feels like. So we need to have a balance of power. There can't be people who have more power than others. And that kind of emotional safety is massively important. And it's at the heart of all the work that I do. So when people start sharing, there is a sense of witnessing, of that deep listening and that caring for the person who is doing the sharing. And that emotional safety is in a lot of programs in Northern Ireland. Like you don't hear about it in the news, but there's incredible programs of people coming together, cross community, whatever you want to call it, people who represent different traditions and building empathy with each other. There's an amazing women's program that I'm going to be part of, where these women who come from diverse communities, working class Protestant, working class Catholic, who are seeing what unites them, which of course is much stronger than what divides them. But that is done with a massive amount of emotional safety. So thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Patrick. So now we're going to ask Mauricio from Mexico, if he's still here. Well, hopefully he's still here, to share. Now, he was someone who, I can't remember what year it was, over 10 years ago, there was an incredible peace conference in Sarajevo, International Peace Conference. And Pat and I did a workshop as one of literally hundreds and hundreds of workshops. And I'll never forget his reaction after the talk. He wrote to me that night. And he said, "I will never forget this day. You will accompany every talk and lecture I give, every article I write, every single step I take." I paraphrase an author I once read. "You exist, thus you are possible. Peace exists in you, thus peace is possible." And that was the first time that I realized that part of the work we do is to ignite in people what is possible. And he organized a trip for us to speak in Mexico. And sadly, Patrick Magee wasn't allowed to go because of the USA government, but I went. So Maurice, if you're here, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question or respond?
Thank you. Thank you. I am here. Thank you so much for letting me speak at this event. You are inspiring, Patrick and Joe. You still are inspiring to me, and I don't know how I wrote you those words. Those are the words I was going to say right now, because I really believe them. I think that these words reborn on me right now just by listening to you at this moment. I use you as examples in my classes, in my lectures. We do research for peace in Mexico. And I was so upset that Patrick couldn't make it to Mexico. It was a difficult moment. Patrick had traveled from London, then he went to Madrid. We moved him from Madrid to Colombia, and then he landed at Bogota. And then from Bogota, we took him to Mexico, and he wasn't allowed in the country. And he had to do all the way back. And we had to solve, because we had so many events organized in Mexico, but now without Patrick's voice. How can you do this without Patrick's voice if this is meant to be a dialogue? So we took some videos and we used subtitles so that people could understand what Patrick was saying. It was very difficult, but we made such an impact. Thanks to Joe and thanks to Patrick's voice that we could recover somehow. And I can still tell you, it's just my message today is that you still impacts from those events we held back in 2015. People keep coming at me right now and telling me that they knew someone who was at one of the events and heard your story, listened to your story, and it changed their lives just by listening to you. And I think that is something that we can agree on. Just by telling your stories, you're making a difference. And I remember very well Patrick said back in Sarajevo, I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm not trying to lecture anyone or tell anyone what to do. I'm just telling my story. This is what happened to me. This is what happened to us. And I hope that can somehow make a difference on you. And it has. And from Mexico, I'm talking to you right now. And I still dream of bringing you back and bringing Patrick back if Mr. Biden allows, of course. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. You've given us so much, and it was absolutely heartbreaking that Patrick didn't come. And I remember when I gave the big talk, I don't know how thousands of people were there. Do you remember I had 2 chairs on the stage, and we decided to do it that way. I said one stage is for my father who can't be here because he was killed in a bomb, and the other chair is for Patrick Magee, who planted the bomb, and he can't be here because even though he's been involved in reconciliation work for the last 15 years, he is still classified as a terrorist, so he can't be here. And I want both these men here with me. And then there was the photograph of that, which was very powerful. But the opportunities, I want to thank you that you've given us both. And it's unfinished. We both need to come to Mexico, and I'm sure you can put a good word into the ambassador. Let's make it happen still. So thank you. Patrick, did you want to say anything?
Oh, yes. Well, I was so grateful for all the efforts made in attempting to get me to Mexico. You did get me to Mexico. Unfortunately, I was held in about 5 hours in the immigration pen and put on the next plane back. But I got to Mexico, so thank you for that. You know, it was a bit of an experience. I'd love to go. Love to be there. Yeah.
Thank you. And so now I'm going to pass over to Claire, and we'll be taking some of your questions. We've got another 15-20 minutes. So Claire, over to you.
Okay. Yes, we have the opportunity for a couple of questions, which is great. Thank you to everyone for all your lovely comments in the chat. You've had lots of very positive feedback, Joe, Pat. Personally, your willingness to continue to share with us and engage your vulnerability and your heartfelt sharings, it's always so powerful and such a privilege to listen to you both. And it's just so humbling and great, and thank you for all the work you do. And I'm sure everybody here feels the same way. It's so inspiring. Everyone's been deeply listening, and it's just been amazing. So thank you. Also, before we go to the couple of questions, I have to get to the sort of slightly boring but very necessary part of talking about funding charities. We are a very small charity doing a very large amount of work on a very, very small budget. And in this climate, you know, funding is hard to come by. It's very time consuming, not always successful. And at the moment, Joe is doing absolutely sterling work with young people in the east of London. And as you know, our youth face an awful lot of challenges at the moment, which actually threaten peace. There's racism, there's the effects of the COVID pandemic, there's the economic situation, not to mention the climate and biodiversity catastrophe, which is on their doorstep. And all of these can have an impact on the experience of peace or not, and the increased likelihood of war situations. And Joe helps these young people become positive change makers in their communities. But in order to do this work, we need money. So it would be very much appreciated if you could just consider a donation. All of the money goes directly to furthering our work, and there is no such thing as a donation which is too small. I know lots of people are struggling as well, and it's not easy to come by the pennies. But if you have a little bit of coffee change or even a large amount of money sitting there that could be put to good use, we would be very, very grateful. The link to the donation is in the chat. I hope you can all see that. It's buildingbridgesforpeace.org, and you will find the donate button. Now, the questions. Firstly, we are going to go to Jo Dover to ask her question. Jo, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Claire. And Jo and Pat, it's really nice to hear you both. I know it's 21 years since you met, and it's 20 years since we met at Lusty Beg Island all that time ago. And I do want to commend you both on the work that you've done. I'm interested to know from both of you where you see your future going 21 years onwards, both in relation to how the troubles and your relationship and what how that continues in Ireland, Northern Ireland, Britain, but also beyond, because I know the pandemic has had an impact on travel, but I know also from some of the work I've been doing in more recent years, the impact you're having in other conflict and post-conflict areas is really important. So I'm just interested to know what your plans or thoughts or hopes are. Thank you.
Maybe I'll go first. Good to see you, Jo. Yes, 20 years. Thank you for all you're doing to stop terrorism and violent extremism and create peace in the world. So I've actually been very busy on Zoom and virtually, and been working in some schools and speaking a lot with young people who've become very confused, who are worried about their future, who feel that they're not being listened to. And I've managed to do lots of listening even on Zoom. And one of my projects, as you said, has been said as being a positive change maker. And I remember these 13-year-old girls, they started off just not really that engaged and feeling very confused, and they should be happy because they're now back at school after lockdown, but they weren't happy and didn't know what was going on. And I always start with a little bit of my story, because that puts me in the room and gives me that credibility. And somehow they got seen and heard and validated through sharing my story. And then it's all about the young people. It's about what they're going through, what their dreams are. And after being listened to, they reached a point where they wanted to do something for other people. So they created a project of resilience and kindness. And that's their idea and their plan. We were researching what is resilience, and they decided that they could spread it and they could spread kindness. And they ended up making these beautiful badges and beautiful boxes with lovely words in them and posters, and put them all around the school. And then they realized as soon as they started thinking of other people, they themselves felt better in themselves. So they realized that kindness was contagious, and it built their resilience. Before lockdown, I was doing a lot more projects where young people were creating projects with me to make a difference in the world. I really believe that all young people are positive change makers, and they just need that space where they're allowed to bring out what they're really feeling and believing and what they want to do. I've had feedback, especially from these girls who I remember, who all came from the Muslim community. And after weeks of building that trust and listening, they said to me, one of them said, "This is the first time I've been listened to by a white person who not only has listened, but believes in me and knows I have an important part to play in the world. So I'm going to change my university degree, change my direction now." And sure enough, she did. I mean, it's tragic, that I was first person, because they need to be listened to by everyone all the time. And I take that trust with huge lightness, and I can't assume that trust is going to be there. I value it immensely. I also work in different conflicts around the world. I respond to invitations. So from 1 week, I can be with these amazing women in Iraq, to a group in Kenya, to an international network, to doing my restorative justice locally, to teaching people how to work with conflict themselves so they can have the techniques to move from blame and certainty to empathy and understanding. And my vision is great. You know, I think back to the 27-year-old me that wanted to bring something positive in the world. And now I see the world. I see what's happening. And I feel like I'm just starting. You know, what else can I do? The grassroots work will always continue. And I love to make a difference to young people. That touched my heart deeply. I've just come back from Northern Ireland. And again, I'm reminded that we in England, those of us who are in England, we are partly responsible for the conflict over there. We have a part to play. And obviously I have a big part because of what's happened to me. And I will be going back there. I've been asked to take part, and it's an utter privilege of some of the groups that are meeting now. But to me, my heart holds the world. How can we change our politics so we move from making someone wrong and hurting them and using weapons to actually collaboration and empathy? Because I believe sustainable peace, working with climate crisis, working with poverty and hunger and all the other challenges we have, is only going to change through moving to empathy, letting go of our need to be certain and right, and just caring for our own people, to caring about every single person. So how can our politics move to collaboration and empathy, and actually letting go of I know best to going, well, tell me what you need. Tell me how we can work together, and change the whole punitive language to a more restorative way. So that would be the next area I want to focus on, is more in the politics. But for the moment, it is about the grassroots. It's about going into the schools, working with young people, and the schools where young people feel demonized. No, they don't feel heard. They don't feel they have a voice. They feel no one cares. And I can go in there privileged and say, I care. Tell me your story. Tell me what matters to you. How would you like to change the world? Because you can make a difference. Pass over to Patrick.
Well, I've already mentioned that my time has been largely taken up completing a book. That's done. And during these times of lockdown, etc., we're hopefully beginning the process of coming out of it now, with some hope of that. Therefore, there'll be opportunities will present themselves to carry on the dialogue with Joe, because that hasn't ended. That exploration hasn't ended. We're also in interesting times because it's in Ireland we call it the decade of centenaries. We have the decade of the formation of the partition states, the North and South in Ireland. Now a real hope that at some future point the dialogue has begun and we can begin to shape a new politics on the island together that'll meet everybody's needs, and be as inclusive as possible, and also be an outward-looking political formation. We're not locked in narrowly into ourselves. That's all very exciting. I hope at some level, just as an individual, I can make some contribution to that at the level of debate. So it's really encouraging times. And it's all about contact and dialogue. And it's the heart of what's needed to move things forward. And it's exciting. I mean, you get to I'm 70 now, and you can begin to, there's an awful guilt about the state of the world we've left. So many problems with the economy and, with just the state of the planet. What are we leaving our kids? But then you meet some of these kids, and geez, it's so inspiring. That their enthusiasm and anger. You feed into that anger too, and sometimes that's a motivation. Properly directed. It'll be the spur to change it. But we've left that to them. If only we hadn't left it in such a state. But unequal power balance in this world, it seems to favour people with power and the greed in the world. That's this next generation hopefully be the ones that'll begin to correct that, and perhaps learn something from us, But so it's exciting times, and at some small level, you hope that I'll continue the dialogue with you and meeting others.
Thank you both. We have another question if people are willing to stay on for 5 minutes. I'm aware that the time is out. I'm going to ask Val McKee to unmute herself, and she has a question, and then I'm afraid we'll have to do some summing up. Okay.
Oh, thank you, and thank you both for a really inspirational talk. I just wondered, we go through life and we manage things, don't we? We manage unresolved issues. Can either of you or both of you see a way where we can actually dissolve that issue, and as part of a process to move to a higher level, to evolve to a higher level of consciousness? Because it strikes me that both of you have lifted yourselves so high, as it is, and can you see those next steps, the next best step?
I can just say this, if I can say it before you, Joe. I think what needs to be done also needs to be very practical. I'm not saying I have answers, but the one thing you do recognize that there are a lot of barriers to moving forward. A lot of people don't like threatened by change, and they'll put obstacles in the way of change. But so it's recognizing those barriers and getting around them or over them. All approaches will involve dialogue and contact. A barrier prevents contact. It's removing barriers. So just at that level, very general level, that's what's needed, I think. And should be, if you like a very rough guide, providing a template for action in all sorts of situations, recognizing impediments to change, barriers that prevent people getting together and, to share what they have in common, or arrive at solutions that meets their mutual needs. Recognizing those. That's the template for creating positive change in the world.
Yeah, I think you're right, Patrick. I always say WAR is an acronym for We Are Right. We'll do almost anything, but exactly like you said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Val. Great question. I think the more I get into my feelings and descend, then the more real and the more I can make a difference in the world. And when I share, especially with young people, all the times when I've lost the plot, blown it, blame people, I think they learn more than that, than when I'm talking about the times when I transform things, and for me it's about, I know I am capable of hurting people hugely. I know every day that. So I'm really in touch with my shadow, my blaming. And I think that is so important. And I think that keeps me very grounded and real. And that's where I think the work is actually, it's emotional work is hard and difficult and messy. And there's not one clear way, and we can get it wrong or we can get it right. We're all making it up. We're all experimenting and learning, or doing it our way. So I just had a quick look at the questions for me, and I'm kind of in tears. We've got an amazing one from Anne's daughter. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And David Hartsoff is a great friend, and he's one of our main non-violent heroes. The work he's done is extraordinary in the world, and he talks about nuclear bombs and how can we bring empathy to nuclear bombs. And that's not an easy question to answer, except that, David, I think you're doing it. I think that we need everyone to be more aware that, every time a bomb goes off, there are real people being hurt, who will have children, parents, loved ones, friends. The pain that we have in our family is the same pain that people feel in Afghanistan, in Russia, in China, in Rwanda. We all cry. We all have the same humanity. And the more we can see that, the less likely we're going to want to put nuclear bombs on each other. So together, I think we can make a difference by finding ways to help people build more empathy. And I think that's through storytelling. Storytelling is a very powerful way of people really understanding that connection that we all share. So over to Claire. Sorry, I've just butted in there, broke all the rules and answered lots of questions. Sorry.
Good for you, Jo. A bit of sharing here. It's a bit mad behind the scenes, everyone. But thanks for your patience. I'm just going to ask Sarah Jane Gordon to speak next.
Thank you, everybody. And hello, I used to work in a school in Tower Hamlets in East London. And back in 2015, we hosted Pat and Jo telling their story with a small group of young people, under 20 of them, but it was quite the most mind-blowing hour and a half that any of us in that room at the time had spent. I was reminded of it when Pat was talking about serendipity earlier on. It was one of these things, some people wanted to do a bit of filming for an academic documentary. We really couldn't find a date that would work, but something inside me said, no, let's make this happen. And I was so glad that we did. They both then came back a second time and spoke to lots of students. And since then, Jo has continued to do work with the young people in that school. And I just really wanted to stress in terms of encouraging people to dig deep for Building Bridges for Peace this evening, because the impact of their story on young people is huge. The impact of the work that Jo is doing in terms of listening to and trying to empower young people is absolutely incredible. I remember at one point teaching my most difficult class and thinking, right, I'm going to sort these really annoying 13-year-old girls out by promising them a special chat with this lady after school. And at the end of it, they said, oh my goodness, she's the nicest lady in the whole wide world. And they just loved the fact that they were feeling heard at a time when, particularly as Muslim young people, they weren't feeling listened to, they weren't feeling supported. So I really would encourage anybody that can donate, just please know the value of the work that is being done. That's all I wanted to say. And hello to Pat, because I haven't seen you for a long time.
I remember you. I remember meeting those kids. It's always wonderful talking to young people. Always inspiring.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Just quickly, just Sarah Jane. Oh my goodness, thank you. And of course, because of you, that's how I got into all the schools, because it's always word of mouth. And so Sarah Jane has managed to help me get into many, many schools. And the last funding, I was turned down because they said we had to prove the schools wanted us. So I'm going to get back in touch with you and get a quote for my next funding. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm so pleased that you're here. Over to Claire.
Okay, well, we're nearing the end, folks. I think we all agree that it's been yet again another amazing sharing, another platform. Zoom this time, unusual, the times we're living in, but I think you've both done really, really well, and just an honour. Amazing. Thank you both. And I was wondering whether we could have parting words from you both, a summing up maybe of the last 21 years and how you feel going forward. Pat, maybe you could go first.
Oh, well, I'll sound like a stuck record because it's two words, and I emphasize them: dialogue and contact, and making that happen. Creating the space for it, anything that can be done to move that on, not talking about just me and Joe, but anywhere, wherever you are, if you can facilitate that in your communities, that's what's needed. Okay, that's the heart of the progress needed. That's the starting point.
Thank you, Patrick. I don't feel we've finished with our talks, and I think there's still more in us. And I would love for us to go to Mexico. Colombia, we've nearly gone 3 times, and Pat did get on his way to Mexico, but only the airport. So who knows? But I put it out there that I would love to do some international work, and maybe when we can fly again, because I think being in a country for a few weeks would be incredible. And Patrick, thank you so much for, I think, being so courageous and vulnerable with me for the last 21 years. And thank you, everyone here. There's so many of you that at different times have given support. And I could not be where I am if it wasn't for many of you here and some people who are not here. And it's a privilege to do this work. You know, as a child, I only ever wanted to bring peace into the world. You know, I only ever wanted to stop wars. I have probably rather indulgent poems that I wrote as a teenager about stopping war. That's all I've ever wanted, you know, and now I have a platform and a voice, and we all have a voice. You know, we can all make a difference. Kindness always helps other people. You know, we can all listen to people and say, I care, please tell me your story, I'm here for you. You know, we can all reach out to other people. We can all use social media for something positive. And I really do believe that we all, not only are we, but we need to be positive change makers. But thank you to my trustees. Thank you to all of you. If any of you ever see an opportunity for either me to do my work, which is more these days about workshops or talks, or me and Pat together, then, you know, do let us know. And thank you all for coming. This is being recorded, so we'll be sending out a copy. So thank you. It's been brilliant. I'm very happy.
Thank you.
I can't, you know, if you said to me 21 years ago that this would be happening, I would have run a mile, you know, like I would have gone, that's far too scary. You know, I could not have done it. But, you know, we're here. 21 years feels like we've made it. We're kind of grown up now. And what's going to happen next, which is very exciting. So thank you all.